So next up we've got Hayden Pickering, and Hayden is going to be talking about getting your priorities straight. Hayden.
Hi, hello everybody. Yes, I'm going to do a talk called Get Your Priorities Straight. First of all, a few thank yous. Thank you to Alistair, who invited me to come and talk. Thank you to Barclays for killing it on accessibility. I'm really proud of the fact that I worked on the inclusive design principles at the Paciello group, and then Barclays Access turned it into this really great set of posters and everything. I was just really excited when I saw them, so that was really cool. So, don't know really how to say this. Oh, you've all seen in the synopsis at this stage that I'm going to be talking about something which I never thought that I would dream of talking about in front of a room full of over 100 people. I never thought I'd say this to anyone, but what it is I want to say is I want to talk to you about Taylor Swift. And I'm a Napalm Death fan, so this isn't really my territory. But Taylor Swift's website, a few months back, Alex Hearn noticed this, so I need to credit him there. So Alex Hearn, I think, works at The Guardian, does tech writing with them. The website entered into an interesting design phase. In its iterative process, it came to this sort of compelling, notable sort of place, which I think is worth discussing. Would anyone like to see what I mean by that? Show of hands. Yeah, okay, I thought you probably would. Now, what you're probably thinking is either my laptop's gone to sleep or something else has gone wrong. The slide's missing or something like that. For those of you who can't see, this is just a blank black screen. And the reason it's a blank black screen is because that was what Taylor Swift's website did actually look like for a few hours, weeks, for some time. And Alex noticed this and shared it on Twitter. And I thought it was kind of interesting. Just completely blank, nothingness, void, purgatory. My first reaction to that was that it was a bit derivative, because Metallica did the entirely black artwork. I say entirely black artwork. They've kind of screwed that up by having their own logo on there, and the curly racist snake, I think that's what you call it, the curly racist snake. And of course, they stole the idea from Spinal Tap, who did an record which was none more black after they screwed up and made the misogynistic smell the glove thing. They decided that they just wouldn't produce any artwork, which in their case was a good idea. So there's this sort of a tradition in blackness in terms of artwork in the music industry. Around about the same time, who's seen these? They're kind of like a political matrix thing, where you work out where you are in the political spectrum. If you've seen people do sort of versions of this. So the basic one, like the generic one, is authoritarian against libertarian, and then left against right. And so you answer questions and you work out where you are. It turns out I'm somewhere down here, apparently more left and more libertarian than Gandhi, which is a bit of a surprise to me. But someone did a music version of this. So they were plotting bands around the political spectrum. So somewhere in the top right-hand corner, authoritarian right, so a terrible punk band like Screwdriver, like actual Nazis. And somewhere down the left libertarian end was just like 9-hour bongo jams, like just hippies getting together and just feeling out the rhythm. But what was most interesting to me and sort of relevant to this talk was that in the top center they'd put ideally silence, but in reality Taylor Swift, which I thought was interesting, because given that the website is entirely black, there's no information there whatsoever, they're not giving anything to the user. I thought maybe someone, like there was that guy at Twitter who, just as they were getting fired, decided to delete Donald Trump's account. I thought maybe someone was doing a similar thing at the TaylorSwift.com, and they were like, well, actually nothingness is better than whatever this warbling noise is, so we'll just destroy it all. But I suspect that's not the case, and the reason for that is that this completely black web page, which has no functionality whatsoever, is 300 kilobytes. Although actually, that's only the figure I thought it was to begin with. As it turns out, I had privacy badger turned on, and when I turned it off, it ended up being 800 kilobytes. There's an 800 kilobyte web page which does absolutely nothing for the user whatsoever. To put that into perspective, this is when you do sort of performance-related talks, you always have to compare it to computer games or books or whatever. To put that into perspective, the computer game Populous, in which you literally play a god deciding the fates of countless autonomous individuals, is only 512 kilobytes and fits comfortably on a floppy disk. Frontier Elite 2, I don't know if anyone remembers that one, where you literally fly around in a four-dimensional phantasmagoric experiential universe of infinite space and time. That's only 720 kilobytes. So both of those computer games achieving somewhat more than the Taylor Swift website. For those of you who are younger than I am, this is a save button, save icon. But Taylor Swift's website is just blank. It's just nothing there. It doesn't give you anything like those experiences. Although, admittedly, if the universe was devoid entirely of matter, then playing Frontier Elite 2 would be somewhat like that, I imagine. Alex also noticed that the way that the web page was made black was curiously done using JavaScript. And for those who can't see it, this is a immediately invoked function expression which affects the style of the document body and turns it black. And that's kind of weird and redundant in its own right, because actually enclosing that that expression is not necessary. I mean, it's not like you're going to be using redefining document outside the expression, and also it's the only thing that should be running on that web page anyway. So it's sort of got premature optimization in it, even though it's not doing anything, which is kind of weird. And also, if you think about it, then if JavaScript isn't running, then the user gets literally the opposite experience, because by default, the web page is white, although back in the day, actually, web pages weren't white by default. They were sort of an off-grade. Does anyone remember that? Yeah, and you had to make it white. But these days, they all, I guess, render as white. But anyway, there's a lesson there about not depending on JavaScript for things like making things colored. And the rest of the 800 kilobytes is ad trackers, just ad trackers. Loads and loads of ad trackers. And it's a sort of weird kind of indictment of, well, capitalism, I suppose, in general, that you get to this point where you can offer an experience which is literally a non-experience. You're just putting someone into this sort of purgatory-like state, and at the same time, someone is making money out of it somehow, whilst trading on your identity. So a lot of this talk is going to be pushing the boundary of what inclusion means, and ethics is one of them. The point is, we can't do everything that we want. When working on a project, or in general, really, because we have things like budgets, so we have limited amounts of money. We have time frames. We don't have the whole of history in order to actually make the digital product or service that we're doing. We have limited resources of all sorts, including the actual constraints of the technologies that we're using, and, of course, labor power. And of course, we have family and friends. As much as we'd like to use all of our free time to keep on top of the latest technologies and the latest JavaScript frameworks and everything, our family will want to talk to us and, eat in front of us and the sort of stuff that families do. But the point is, we've got our priorities wrong. There is time to do all of the things which are important to do, but we're actually wasting a lot of our time doing things which aren't important, in my opinion. Here are some signs that your priorities might be out of whack in the way that you're working. Now, this probably doesn't apply to most of you, but this is kind of, I guess, a talk about cultures being broken, following on from what Paul was perhaps more incisively saying. So, for instance, if your organization is spending lots and lots of time discussing the relative merits of these two shades of red. I mean, I think we've all been there, if we've ever had a design meeting. And you get extra points, of course, if you use pseudopsychology to justify your reasoning for why one is better than the other. The more muted red creates more comfort and therefore trust in the user, or the more vibrant red creates more sort of feelings of urgency and raises the user's metabolism or something like that. We say stuff like this: ultimately, re-implementing the application in Cycle.js is a net benefit to the user. I'm sorry, this is really bad for the person who's doing the... So ultimately, re-implementing the application in Cycle.js is a net benefit to the user because its intrinsically reactive and functional nature makes my experience as a developer more ergonomic and therefore my productivity higher. So basically what we're doing there is we're deciding to focus on a new toy because it's fun to play with, and then post-rationalizing it in a way that makes it sound like we actually care about the people we're making things for. Also, we tend to provide limited, reductive, and not helpful information in the worst way possible. Because for some reason, saving space is important. We like things to be minimalist. We like to take things away, even important things away, just so things look neat, right? You should be providing more information. Obviously not overloading people with information, but you shouldn't be just following a scamp where there's very little information and then deciding that, no, we can't put this important stuff here, which actually helps people use the interface. And of course, we enshrine everything we do in these incredibly complex and bloated systems, because we like to pretend that the thing that we're building is going to last forever, when actually most of the things we build are either ditched or destroyed or are defunct or out of date within about 3 or 4 days. So I guess what we do is we pay lip service a lot to the idea of putting users first. We don't really mean it. And as I said, I think most of the time, we serve ourselves rather than the user, and then we come up with this sort of post-rationalization or these kind of excuses or ways of justifying the fact that we're doing that. So performance is one example. Performance is a good thing, and in terms of sort of intersectionality, in terms of inclusive design, performance is a really interesting one to me, because generally speaking, if something's more performant, then most people will benefit, but it has very specific effects on, say, folks who are using assistive technologies as well. I used to do a lot of testing on an extremely bloated Drupal site, and I couldn't work out why it was so awful when used with NVDA and JAWS, and it was simply because there were so many DOM nodes that the refreshing the virtual cursor was just couldn't handle it, basically. So performance is good, and it is an inclusive design concern, but we need to be careful about how we approach performance. There's a sort of busy work way of approaching performance, which is, let's do something which could be defined as working towards performance, or there's actually trying to make things more performant, actually doing the real work and actually making things work better. Some time ago now, Ben Frayne pretty much had the last word on CSS selector performance, so the relative performance between different kinds of CSS selector. He did lots and lots of studies around it and some empirical tests and stuff, and basically just came to the conclusion, yeah, it doesn't really make any difference to the user. It's not something that you should worry about or think about very much. If you're interested in seeing and actually being able to measure selector performance, here's how you do that. You get 6 million DOM nodes, and you put them all into one web page. That's the first thing you do. Then you heat them up to about 300 degrees C. Then you apply the worst CSS selectors you can possibly imagine. You put all of this into a 15-year-old browser, because really it's only the really ancient browsers which have trouble parsing CSS selectors or certain types of CSS selectors anyway. Then you fire it around a Large Hadron Collider. And if you're really lucky, you will see or be able to measure some sort of effect. You might be able to see, for instance, the difference between applying the first of these selectors, which is, for those who can't see it, a element selector qualified with a class versus a parent child selector. So here's like the most important thing I want to say today. Just because something is measurable doesn't mean it matters. Just because we can say, well, actually, technically, 0.00001 if I do this, but then if I do 0.00002 here, then see, it's measurable. So therefore, that must mean something. And I get a lot of kickback when I tell people this. They say, well, yeah, but every little helps. Like, so if I'm making it more performant or I'm making it more accessible even incrementally, then that must be a good thing. I must be, doing God's work, working in the right direction, whatever you call it. No, that's not true. And the reason is because we have limited budgets, we have limited time frames, limited resources, and sometimes our family wonder where we are. So you have to prioritize. You have to compromise and therefore prioritize. So for instance, a low priority should be feeling all engineering and having data and charts to stick on your blog and being able to say, look, I measured this with this enormous study. But a high priority would be to just do the basic things, like the non-sexy, non-engineering, I can write home about it things to just make things better. So that means sometimes making big decisions, like genuinely big decisions, like can we actually get rid of this enormous dependency? And it's likely to be an unpopular decision and a difficult one to argue. But sometimes, if you're doing something which is generated as a static blog, but you're used to using jQuery because it's kind of ergonomic for you as a developer, that's not good enough necessarily. So you should be getting rid of that dependency and then trying to do things in vanilla JavaScript, for instance. And just use fewer images. Like we use far too many images all the time, which is a terrible thing in terms of performance, in terms of the actual payload. But it's also a terrible thing because we rely too much on what's visual in order to express things, which obviously has accessibility implications as well. By the way, do you know why it's called a hero image? It's because the user says, thanks for the pointless 500 kilobyte image, you're a fucking hero. So there you go. And also, the weird thing about hero images is that they're usually of something you can see already. So I'm sitting at my desk in front of my laptop with my notepad and pen and my phone next to me, and I'm downloading this image, and it's just that's what's in front of me now. So yeah, that kind of winds me up, the fact that that's such a thing. So of course, imagery is important for accessibility and broadly speaking in terms of inclusion. Some people understand concepts better in terms of imagery, but there are better ways to use imagery. So iconography is proven to help assist people in understanding and being able to find controls and things like that. And also it internationalizes an interface somewhat. So a smiley face is a smiley face in more or less any language, for instance. But you can do that really efficiently. So you can kind of be intersectional, and you can provide the accessibility dimension of that, but also not take a big hit. So I did a thread of Svg Icons on Twitter. This is before it got to 280 characters. So these are all icons which are under 140 bytes. So for instance, this is the menu icon, like the 3-line one. So it's just 3 rectangles turned into a path. So it's really tiny. Same with a check mark. Same with an arrow, which is really small. And of course, if it's not a decorative image, you have to make it accessible. And so you do have to make, you have to write more code, not much more code. But it's okay to write more code if it actually makes a difference to the user, right? So you could turn in role text and put aria label right on there, or you could have aria label by and connect that to the title inside the SVG. That's another way of making an SVG have like a textual label to it. Or you can actually use a text element there, and in this case I've used a visually hidden class, so it's not visible but it is still accessible to assistive technologies. And the thing is, it's not difficult to do that stuff. Like I learned making accessible HTML in maybe a year. And I'm still trying to learn JavaScript, so that's still taking me a long time. So when you get kickback from people saying, well, no, but it's really difficult to do accessibility, it's not true, is it really? And that's worth noting, I think. So pixel perfection. Who's heard the expression pixel perfection? And people talk about pixel perfection when it's a job description, and they always say we're looking for someone who can do pixel perfection. And I think I don't want to apply for that job. That sounds like a nightmare because it's never going to be perfect, is it? So they're always just going to be beating you down. Anyway, so in terms of an anecdote from a long time back, I was working on a little app where there's the ESA and there's the PIP support allowances. So some people, for whatever reason, can't be in employment, or they may have a disability. In any case, these are benefits that certain people are entitled to, but they have to be assessed to see if they are entitled to these benefits, or that those benefits can be continued. And there were people falling through the net here, because it's actually done in a really awful way where people actually have to be interviewed. There was a really kind of stark example where there was a guy who had a muscular issue where it made him look like he was smiling all the time. So when he went into the interview and they assessed him to see if he was okay or not, they thought, well, he looks like a cheery chap, and sent him on his way basically, and they docked his payment, or he wasn't therefore found out to be entitled to the support, which is awful. So we made this little app which basically was like a quiz which helped folks to kind of run through the interview process. And so we did some user testing, as you do, and we did this in Hastings in a little building, and we hadn't, I guess, thought about some factors that we should have done. Now, we were careful to make sure that if this testing was going to be upstairs, that it would have to be downstairs if there were people who, for instance, were wheelchair users. There weren't any, but we hadn't factored in some other things. So there were 6 people supposed to turn up that day, and only one person actually made it, because that's the thing when you do user testing with folks who have disabilities or have trouble traveling, is that most people will drop out. You just have to accept that that's the case. Our friend, let's call him Jeff, he did actually make it, bless him for coming. We had one small flight of stairs up to where we were doing the testing, and it took him 5 minutes to get up the stairs. And then he sat down, and we couldn't speak to him to start with because he was so out of breath. And it took him another 10 minutes to catch his breath. So this was really instructive for me, this experience. From one point of view, which was that invisible disabilities are a thing, and Paul talked about invisible disabilities earlier, which I'm grateful for. I should have known better, because I have things which I guess you could call invisible disabilities. I've had lots of mental health issues, and I've crippling anxiety at times, which has made my life much more difficult to live, including like having physical issues from that. Something I hadn't bargained for so much. But that's kind of not so much what I want to talk about in terms of prioritization. So yes, he had very limited energy, but also he was a complete technophobe. He'd spent the last 10 years of his life not using any kind of technology really, and being mostly out of contact with other human beings, basically living life as a hermit. And when he turned up with his very first mobile phone that he'd ever had. So bearing all of this in mind, let's plot features that we had in our, or possibly might have had in our application, and fucks given by him about those features. First of all, subtle drop shadows around the buttons, right? 0 fucks given. Not interested in those, and also probably really not interested in, the relative merits of a 5-pixel versus a 3-pixel drop shadow and what shade it should be in. Golden ratio based typography. Now, he could well understand and be aware of the golden ratio principle and the maths behind it. That might be a personal interest to him. But as he's trying to claim crucial support that basically keeps him alive, so an allowance that means that he's not fucked, do you think that he would be, asking us or judging us on whether or not we laid everything out strictly based on the golden ratio? No, of course not, no. And lifelike animation timing functions. So using physics to make things bounce around like they're gnomes in a Disney film or whatever. No, obviously didn't care about any of that either. So basically, well, I guess what I'm saying is that real people aren't looking to be delighted. I mean, developers are real people in a way, but what I'm saying is users, people who aren't already obsessed with that thing. It's not their thing, is it? You know, it's not what they are into. And they're not looking for immersion either. They don't want to be kind of drawn into this immersive, oh, isn't this wonderful experience? They don't like technology. A lot of people just aren't that interested in it. So they just want to get on with their lives. Because they also have limited resources, patience, for example, time frames, and, you know, if they're lucky, family and friends. I always kind of, the analogy that always pops up in my head for this kind of thing is, I don't really like travelling by train. I came here by train, it was okay. Trains to me are sort of compressed tubes of noisy, ignorant people. I'm a misanthrope, so I'm bound to say that. But when I'm booking train tickets, I just want to book train tickets, right? If they made an experience which is so good, so like immersive and enjoyable, that I'd want to book the train tickets, then cancel them, then book them again just for the experience. I mean, I'd have to be a bit weird, but also that can't be good for them in terms of their business and the way that they manage things either. So we need to get over this whole delight immersion thing, basically. Incidentally, the chap who turned up to this user testing session, I think Jeff is what I called him, misnomered him. He had a Windows phone, and I never held or touched or seen a Windows phone in my life, and I knew they existed, but I the thing is, because I live in this filter bubble where I'm surrounded by the developers and designers who all have Android phones and iPhones, it never occurred to me that this would come up, and but I thought, no, do you know what? That's okay, because I designed the app in such a way that I wasn't worried about whether it looked perfect on an iPhone or was just so on an Android phone, and using those browsers and those handsets. I made something which, broadly speaking, was flexible and responsive. So it worked on this Windows phone. I was very relieved, obviously, because he was able to use the application. So that's the sort of second big sort of takeaway or thing that I wanted to say, is that it's kind of like that expression, perfection is the enemy of good. But that's not just, that doesn't just mean, in my mind at least, perfection is a bad thing to pursue because it will take you forever because it's unattainable. It's not just that, it's a time sink thing. It's also the problem of, if you are making something perfect, you can only make it perfect under certain conditions. That's the only way you can really measure perfection, is if you have certain constraints. And that's not how the web works, or what any of what we do really works. For something to be a truly decent experience for lots of people, you have to forget about perfection for just the person who looks and sounds and has the same technology as you. So I was on Twitter the other day, and there was someone who was giving out UI tips, like just little tips and little tweaks and things like that, to make your UI pop, or whatever the expression is, right? And so if you'll look here, quite clearly the difference between actually no, because of the way that the display is working there, you can't see it, because it's added the same effect anyway. On my screen, the top one is simply white text on a light grey background. And the bottom one, there's a subtle drop shadow there, which helps lift the text off the page. And I saw this, and I sort of did that thing that dicks do, which is to quote tweet it and say, well, that's all very good, but actually this would be better, because then you'd actually be solving a real problem here, because you'd actually be addressing the contrast issue, and then more people could actually see it. And so am I an arsehole? Yeah, probably I am, yeah, because he was giving out free UI tips. He's a nice enough guy. But there's a really kind of important underlying thing here, which I think needs to be said, and that's that your priorities betray your privileges and your prejudices. And that's not to say that you're necessarily mean harm or you're excluding people consciously. But if you're worrying about these little tiny foibles and this sort of frippery, then you've led a sheltered life. It's as simple as that. But that can be unlearnt. I had to unlearn that to some extent. This blue British passport is kind of like what I think about in these situations, because if you're someone who's sheltered and totally insulated from economic and social decay, you live in like a gated community in a multi-million-pound house and have infinite access to private healthcare, then you can prioritize things like the color of your passport. Anyway, right, so Paul promised not to do the Brexit, and I'm afraid I can't promise that. I had to touch on that. But I think it's sort of emblematic of this sort of where privilege means that you can kind of, you worry about things which don't really matter. So if you're worried about your design work being sort of self-serving, then we've started a checklist. There's too many checklists around. This was kind of started out as a weird idea, I guess, but just to have this massive flood of different inclusive design ideas, because there's so many. So there's already hundreds of them, and this is within a couple of weeks or whatever. But lots of people have stepped in and said, well, actually, let's organize this and tag this, and I've had loads and loads of contributions. And I've learnt stuff from this checklist, just because if you read it from top to bottom, there's bound to be some inclusive design provisions, ideas that you haven't thought of. One was all caps writing. So that can be backed up by lots of people, is that it's less readable in lots of circumstances. So that's just one that I hadn't really thought about that much. I know that sometimes it's a problem with screen readers, where if you use all caps, then it'll actually read it out letter by letter, but that's a slightly separate issue, but yeah. So just this is sort of like the final stretch now. So just the thing about code vanity, this is another sort of self-serving thing. We worry about what we put in our code, because not how it works for users. We should be thinking that, I think, generally as an industry. I'm not saying you. But we're more worried about how we think other developers see it. We don't want to embarrass ourselves in front of our peers. But unfortunately, that gets us into the mindset, I think, of being self-serving again. There was this keeps coming up over and over again, the idea that CSS is broken because some people don't seem to be able to use it particularly well. Perhaps because they're focused more on JavaScript, or they're more used to grown-up programming languages or whatever. This was a article written by Sergio called "CSS Is Broken," and he opens with this question: how many important markers, which is where you trump the specificity of your properties, right? How many importance do you think you have in your project? And I thought, well, actually not very many. And the reason was, I make really simple interfaces, so there's not that much CSS. There doesn't have to be. That's not always, possible. But it turns out that he has 162 importance across 34 files. I can't remember the last time I used more than one style sheet, I don't think. But that's a lot of importance, and it's kind of an embarrassing thing for you. The user doesn't know. I mean, perhaps the sheer amount of CSS would be a problem for the user in terms of download, etc. But it's this kind of thing where we get totally obsessed with this stuff and really go overboard with it. And then we come up with all of these different ways to solve it. So we're trying to solve the technology, we're trying to fix the technology, but actually the problem is, the only reason we got into this situation in the first place is because our interfaces are too complex. And that's a cultural problem because of feature creep and because of just trying to throw everything at the page. But nevertheless, we can't accept that, or we're not empowered to address that, I guess, a lot of the time as developers. So we go after this technological problem instead. And the thing is, if we really, really wanted to just solve the problem of CSS specificity, this is what we'd do. We'd get one giant image, a big JPEG, and stick it on the page, and we'd put a big map element over the top of it, and then we'd do little areas. Has anyone ever used, this is quite old, old HTML now. This is how I used to make websites, right? I used to make really shitty websites like this. So it'd be a big image, because then, you know, you've got total control over how that image looked. This is how we did things before we had web fonts. You'd make it in Photoshop with whatever font you liked, and then you'd turn it into an image and whack it on a web page. Obviously, it's terrible for performance because it's just one massive image. It can't be parsed by assistive technologies or search engines or anything, but it does solve the specificity problem, doesn't it? So, great. So, rounding up, the life of a developer, the life of anyone is short, sorry, but it is. And but that doesn't have to be a bad thing as long as you get your priorities straight, because most of everything doesn't matter. Most of everything you experience as a human being is bullshit, really. But there are good things, and if you get your priorities straight, whether it's in terms of your design work or any other area in your life, then that's not such a problem. And that does leave time to be creative. You get rid of all the stuff you don't need to do. There's still time to have a bit of fun. Now, as experimentally, I thought, well, I wonder how much I could do for the Taylor Swift organization. So I did one of those speculative redesigns. I thought, well, it can't get much more rubbish than just a black page. But I thought, since most of that code was really just in the service of ad companies and ad networks, if you took that away and did the ethical thing, which is an inclusive design thing, took away all of that ad stuff, the 800K, then you've still got loads to play with, haven't you? I could get all the way up to 800K if I was just doing code which was focused actually on the user, and I'd be doing so much more. And so I came up with this, which is, it's just like an animation, basically. Now, I don't know what Taylor Swift fans are into, but I kind of figured this was the sort of thing. But it's sort of like, it's an all singing, all dancing design, right? That's 100K, so that's a fraction of it. That's an SVG which I haven't bothered to optimize, and it's still a fraction of what they had before, and there was nothing there. And I think there's hopefully a lesson there in terms of priority. Anyway, that's everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that rousing talk. I'm sure you've all been left hugely... Anyway, any questions in the room for Hayden? Or are you all just stunned by the brand new Taylor Swift? Can somebody tweet her that and see what happens? Anyway, any questions from the room? Jamie?
How did you get so awesome? Basically, I don't know how to answer that. Mostly, I do whatever Taylor Swift does, and yeah, just follow her lead, really. I'm a privileged white person myself, so you know there's a lot of tips that you can pick up on the way.
Go ahead.
Oh.
You've made some points that are from the political spectrum, I believe. How would you go about? So you're talking about focusing on the user. You're talking about using technology to solve goals. So rather than going for the easy one of asking, what do you think of React? Instead, how do you think that as developers we can change the opinions of other developers to focus on the sorts of things you just talked about? How can we make this happen?
Okay, that's... Oh, I think I might have...
No, you're okay.
Oh, I'm back. So just to reiterate the question, it was... I guess it's how do we do good argumentation with other people in order to get the best out of things, rather than focusing on just arbitrary decisions, I guess, yeah. I think it's getting to know your logical fallacies and things like that. So actually, my brother's a barrister, and I was talking to him about this the other day, and he went to Oxford University, and then he did one of those DPhil things, and then he did a master's, and he's just studied and studied and studied. Most of his work is just dealing with difficult people, and that's just people skills, right? And it's the same in the development world. So when you learn to be able to politely refute people's weird, arbitrary likes and dislikes, and actually point out the fact that maybe they're going down a self-serving or at least a line that isn't really actually helpful and isn't well argued or justified. If you can do that politely and clearly, then you're an amazing developer. It doesn't fucking matter how good you are at code, you know. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Any other questions in the room? You think you've stunned them into silence? Or they just don't want to get your wrath back at them. There's a question in the middle of the room.
Quite friendly, really.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Catherine Moonan. I'm a freelancer. I work with Sainsbury's at the moment. So Hayden, I just want to congratulate you for shaking things up a little bit. That was a wonderful presentation, and I absolutely loved the way that you framed, you know, the sort of nonsensical, navel-gazing conversations we can end up having in the context of privilege, and you know, it can often be incredibly difficult to sort of, you know, introduce teams to concepts like not everybody has got a Mac, not everybody has got high fidelity eyes. When you see those greys that we're arguing about how different they are, actually when you look at them on a projection, never mind on an old piece of equipment or with, you know, with low vision, you can't see the difference anyway. So it's a wonderful way to think about it, but I do wonder how, if you use that in a real context, you might just end up making people feel uncomfortable, and then that can make them defensive. And I just wanted to say about with your point about when you're testing with users with access needs, they don't turn up. Well, I'm sorry, that's not true, Hayden. They might not have turned up for you, but people do turn up, and I just wouldn't want that point you made. I know you were sort of being a bit glib to sort of leave people who are thinking about testing with users with access needs to put them off. You may need to pay a bit more attention to, you know, how you're getting the user there, you know, what sort of info you're giving, but you know, people do show up for the tests, and you know, we really need to keep getting people through the door to test our products. I'm
glad you've clarified that for me. I wasn't trying to say that that there's no point inviting people. It's just that I guess what I was saying is you have to be understanding of the difficulties that people face, and not be discouraged when people don't turn up. I guess it's just one of those things that you have to prepare for. Maybe set aside a couple of days, or expand the time frame, or that kind of thing. Yeah, I'm sorry if that came across as glib and a bit unclear, I guess.
Great. One last question.
Hi Hayden, Anthony Kennedy. I really enjoyed your presentation. I was with you all the way until the last slide. Well, whilst I also quite like Napalm Death, and I do quite like Taylor Swift as well, and so does my 13-year-old daughter. I would wonder, if you replaced her website with this image, you seem to have missed out the alt attribute, and I wonder if you could describe that for us, please.
That's good. So, that is a brilliant question. So, if for those who didn't hear it, can you please now provide the alt text for this image? So, okay, so let's break this down. So, first of all, this is an image with text in it. So you have to be clear. You have to actually say the text as part of the alt text, obviously. So, a little tricky with the basic thing, because it's kind of repetitive in this case. But that's kind of an outlying problem, I think. But I mean, quite often it will just be, I suppose typically it will just be text, so it'll be text represented as an image, which it shouldn't be because it's difficult to translate, and it degrades when you zoom it. As we all know, that's a WCAG failure if you do that. So I guess, yeah, it would be white privilege, Taylor Swift with a hypnotic belly decal, twiddling her hair whilst being bombed, standing next to some miniature KKK people, and an atomic explosion under a beautiful starry sky.
basic.
Is that right?
Great, and another round of applause for Hayden. So Owen at the back is going to switch my slides, so we've got just 2 last slides. So thank you all very much for coming along this evening. That is all of the talks. We still have about 40 minutes worth of time in the building for networking. The next meetup is on the 12th of February, and we have literally in the last hour confirmed the speakers. So Leonie Watson is going to be joining us, as is Jamie, is going to come from the back to the front, so you can all build up your hard questions for Jamie for next time. And just, the last slide's a little self-serving. Please follow Barclays Access on Twitter. We're trying to do some great work in this space. We've got some great resources that we're about to release from a video content point of view. Please follow us, please interact. We're also, as well as London Accessibility Meetup, we support Access Chat, which happens on a Tuesday night. So if you don't know what Access Chat is, go to accesschat.com. It's a weekly chat, Twitter chat on accessibility and inclusion. It would be great to see you there every Tuesday evening. That is it for this evening. Like I say, we've got some more drinks and some more nibbles and food next door. Thank you all very much for coming.
You